Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 5. So today we're going to talk about two interesting terms, and these are plurilingualism and translingualism. I know that we usually tackle the concept of translanguaging or translingualism as using students' first language as a bridge to cross over to the second language, or as a tool that helps students transfer the background knowledge of their first language into learning the second language or the third language. But translanguaging is much more than that. It is a framework for understanding second language acquisition and the mechanism on how it happens. So we're gonna tackle the theory and pedagogical practices of both plurilingualism and translingualism. First, I feel like it's essential for us to differentiate between multilingualism and plurilingualism. Multilingualism is considered a problematic term in the literature because it indicates someone's having one dominant language, L1, and L2 or L3 that are below. So the linguistic competency, the person's linguistic competencies within their second or third language are below the dominant language. So there's a hierarchical relationship in there. However, plurilingualism is also being able to speak in more than one language, but it emphasizes the need to honor the first language and problematizes the notion of the native speaker and opposes linguistic racism. However, it also considers that each language is an incomplete linguistic system. So there is still a sense of hierarchy in plurilingualism as well. Now, there's a third term, and that is translanguaging or translingualism. And this is the ideal understanding of second language acquisition and the hierarchical relationship between our first language and the second and third languages that we learn. However, translanguaging might be too idealistic, so keep that in mind while I explain what translanguaging as a framework of understanding how second language acquisition happens. So according to Ophelia Garcia, who's a professor at the University of New York and a leading researcher in the fields of bilingualism and bilingual education, who's also, by the way, one of the founders of translanguaging as a learning framework, she defines translanguaging as the process by which multilingual speakers use their languages fluidly and flexibly to make meaning and communicate. So what we need to remember is that translanguaging is with all of us who are bilinguals. You may be hearing what you think is English now when I'm speaking to you, but I'm selecting from my language repertoire signs and sounds that the society recognizes as English. So let me explain this a bit more. So there are two ways of understanding how second language acquisition works. There's the external perspective, and that is the perspective of society, schools, language institutions, politics and policies. And there's the internal perspective of how it happens inside our brain. So according to the external perspective, they explain how second language acquisition happens in an additive bilingualism framework. And that is, we learn our first language. So let's say that your first language is English. So it is stored in your brain as a separate entity. I really like visuals. So I used like I color coded the brain. So let's imagine that this pink space in our brain is dedicated for English. And then you learn your second language, let's say it's French, and it takes another separate place in your brain as a named language, as French, okay? And then you learn your third language, let's say it's a Mandarin, and then you learn your third language, let's say it's Italian, and each language, each named language is stored separately in your brain. This is the additive bilingualism or the external perspective. This is how society looks at languages. Society and schools look at languages as different entities. Each language, each named language is separate than the other. However, the Internal perspective looks at languages or looks at our brain. Let's say that this funnel shape is our brain, and all languages, each time you learn a language, whether it's your first language, second language, third language, fourth language, whatever, they are combined together in your language repertoire. Okay, so I used this color because I felt like it shows the fluidity of our language repertoire. So you cannot, in your brain, indicate that this is English, this is French, this is Mandarin, or this is Italian. So your language repertoire forms a reserve of linguistic features of which you select to use certain vocabulary, grammar structures, and other elements of language that are appropriate to communicate in certain contexts. So this repertoire has fluidity of language features that are not named and identified as separate systems in your brain, but rather one big complex system. So let's think our teeth in the external perspective first in order to understand what has the social and political factors got to do with this standpoint. So according to the external perspective, named languages are standardized conventions that belong to nation state and are taught and tested. Now, I'm not saying that the external perspective is wrong or that it's not important. On the contrary, this is very important, and having named languages and teaching them as separate languages and testing them is really important, except we should not start there. Language teachers need to start with the internal perspective of the speaker and reflect on the entanglement of words, cultural practices, linguistic functions in which bilinguals are always immersed in. Now, what do we do in schools? In real life, what we do is that we emphasize that external perspectives of named languages is the most important, and we ignore the internal complex perspective of the speaker. So this standpoint needs to shift. As teachers, not only we look at the second language acquisition from an external point of view or an external perspective, but we also have misconceptions on the internal perspective of second language acquisition. So oftentimes it is assumed that bilinguals have one dominant language, and thus there is a hierarchical relationship between their known languages, which is not the case for the internal perspective. In order to understand the internal perspective better, think of the sea. Where does the sea end and where does the sand begin? Now, the answer is it depends on where you're standing, right? So the same metaphor can be applied on our languages, the internal perspective of second language acquisition. So we don't know where one language ends and where the other begins. Now, it is important to understand that the internal perspective of translanguaging is multifaceted. It comprises of the linguistic repertoire or our idiolect. Now, the idiolect is like the unique linguistic characteristics that we have, including vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation that are specific to an individual person, and it differs. So our idiolect is unique to us. We use certain vocabulary, we use certain accents. So this is our idiolect. But there's also the communicative repertoire, which are gestures, context, or other ways of making meaning. And the aim of using the linguistic repertoire and the communicative repertoire is for the hearer to construct a message, to understand the meaning, but that is not always guaranteed, is it? Now that we tackle the theoretical part of translanguaging, I feel like it's equally important to understand the practical application of translanguaging in our classrooms. In order to do so, we need to understand or answer three questions. Why is translanguaging important? What should we take into consideration, and how can we apply translanguaging in practice? Let's start with the why translanguaging is important. When we are not taking translanguaging into account in our classrooms, we are doing injustice to the learners. We are minoritizing them, whether we are teaching children, teenagers, or even adults. It's the same result. We are not doing social justice. We are not thinking about how to make the situation more equal among these students. Let's remember that when we are teaching bilingual students or bilinguals, we are only mobilizing less than half of their repertoire. We're leaving a big portion of it away, and we're not considering it at all. And more importantly, when we assess them, we are testing them in also less than half of their repertoire. So of course, they will be doing less than monolingual people. So what are the things that we need to consider before applying the translanguaging framework in our classrooms? First and foremost is your stance. That is your belief that languages go beyond the named languages. Thus, you need to think about how to construct a unitary voice that belongs to the students, that is their own, and that they do not have two separate identities for these two different languages that they speak. It's important to have a belief that students have one identity that is complex and dynamic. Teachers usually believe that translanguaging is a way to facilitate meaning. That is true, but it is also important to believe that translanguaging shapes students and who they are. The second thing is the design of your curriculum or the material that you're teaching. Keep in mind translanguaging when you're designing material, and be prepared to be flexible and shift your plan according to the needs of your students. Now, how can we practically implement translanguaging in our classrooms? We can do so by teaching through and about several languages to promote language awareness and proficiency in multiple languages. We can also do so by leveraging students' full linguistic repertoire without separating languages rigidly, and by teaching grounded in students' own cultural and linguistic backgrounds to sustain and nourish their identities. These are additional language-related policies that can be specifically implemented in schools, like encouraging home languages in classrooms, offer multilingual learning materials, hire multilingual teachers, promote multilingual signage, partner with multilingual families, and assess in multiple languages. If you recall, at the beginning of the presentation, I indicated that translingualism and plurilingualism could be an idealistic approach of teaching second language in our classrooms. I found an article by Kuputa, published in 2016, that tackles concerns regarding the theoretical foundation of plurilingualism and translingualism. So I would advise you to pause the video, read the quote that I chose for you, and then you can go to the link in Brightspace, the Padlet. It's under Activity 1. And I want you to list the benefits and the challenges for implementing translanguaging in our classrooms. There's also these are the references, and there's also a song that I uploaded on Brightspace for a trilingual singer. He sings in Arabic, English, and French, and mixes these three languages in a way that is difficult to distinguish each language from the other. I felt like it's the perfect illustration of the internal perspective of translanguaging that is, you can actually see that is tangible. So I hope you enjoy it.
كيما سيركوس موني وهنا مع التخوانية أين كلنا جاهزين اللحم زقل نزيد دخانية كل الشي اللي قدامي فيش حدا عدانية حاس علي بالو تالي كاس وروبا شال شرطي على هادية Okay but I don't know about the things you wanna do On s'appelle elle a déjà pris le rendez-vous Un ticket sans retour et vient à Malibu Elle dit Habibi rien se mettra entre nous Hein, et je suis en tête à tête